Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. The board met in executive session to discuss a collective bargaining agreement. So we've pledged our allegiances and we have taken roll call. So let's move on to the approval of the agenda. Ms. Shields?
Be it resolved that upon the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools, the Board of Education hereby approves the agenda as written.
May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? No? Great. The next meeting of the Haldane Board of Education is scheduled for Tuesday, October 18th, 7 p.m. in the Auditorium. That will be a workshop meeting, the topic being the Campus Master Plan, the next iteration of that. We've got a pretty full agenda this evening, so I'm going to just go ahead and give it over to you, Superintendent Benante.
Just a few remarks before we transition to a conversation around Garrison tuition rates. I wanted to mention, as the board's aware, on Saturday, a visiting student athlete suffered what at the time we thought was a very serious injury, which required a significant response on the part of our athletic trainer, McNall, and athletic director, Mr. John Bauerlein. The student athlete was transported via helicopter. We actually had to helivac the student, the EMS had to medevac the student from here to Westchester Medical Center. And we're all pleased to hear, though, that the student appears to have avoided serious injury. And I want to thank and publicly acknowledge Ms. Crow and Mr. Bauerlein for their actions on the field, as well as the student athletes and parents and additional support staff who were on site that allowed for our emergency responders to come into the facility and work and support the student, his family, in a safe but expeditious manner. So it was quite, I think many were very worried for a period of time there, but happy to say the student athletes seems to be recovering just fine. This is homecoming week, so it's culminating with our Athletic Hall of Fame induction on Sunday. I just wanted to wish our student athletes good luck who are competing this week, and as the fall season begins to come to a close, it's a very exciting time on campus. As our board members may have noted, the Current is running a feature on children's mental health and well-being and the impact of the pandemic under mental health over the last several years, and a few of our practitioners were interviewed for the series. I want to thank them, and its a focus on this week's report was on the use of federal aid to expand mental health services and supports in schools. As you may recall, we didn't receive a lot of federal aid, just given our size and also some other variables that were factored into that. What aid we did receive, we directed towards academic support for students through the interventionist. That being said, we still directed a lot of time and energy into supporting the mental well-being of our students over the last couple of years, and will continue to do so. As I shared with the Current, that's being supported through our local and state funding more so than the federal funding that we received. And we look forward to seeing the future reports as part of that series over the next 2 weeks. The school climate results were shared with the community today, so those should be in your inbox. So receive those, and that concludes my announcements. Continues to be a very busy school year. I do want to transition to a discussion regarding the Garrison tuition, and I have some slides to share that Megan's going to pull up. Prior to that, though, I want to welcome Kent Schacht from the Garrison Union Free School District. Kent is an active board member at Garrison, also serves on their finance committee, if I have that right, Kent. And I'm going to ask Kent to start, just because Kent can provide some perspective just from the Garrison end of this on some of the factors that contributed to your budget development or Garrison's budget development last school year. And then I will transition to sharing some of the terms of the current instructional contract, and Peggy and Sean and I can then facilitate a discussion around the conversation we had with other representatives from Garrison just 2 weeks ago. So Ken, if you wouldn't mind, and then I'm just going to circle in right behind you, Ken.
So thank you all for having me this evening. On behalf of the Garrison Board, I want to say how much we really appreciate this relationship between our two schools and our two communities, which really make up one community, obviously Phillipstown. During the recent renovation at Garrison last year, we found some documents. I don't know if they're in a wall or somewhere, but they reminded us that the first ever graduating class of Garrison Union Free School attended Haldane High School, and we've been doing it proudly for over a century since. So kids from Garrison grow up in Cold Spring, grow up together in Phillipstown. They participate in activities together, from Phillipstown Little League, Depot Theater, Phillipstown Soccer Club, Garrison Arts Center, among many. Cold Spring athletes wear Garrison across their chests when they play modified soccer, and Garrison kids proudly wear Haldane across their chests playing modified baseball, softball, and football. These teams, which sometimes dub themselves the Blue Cougars, a nod to the mascots, are a symbol of the tight bonds that make our community really special. It's a relationship that everyone in Garrison really wants to continue, and nobody more than me. After attending Guffs for 9 years, I have a daughter who's a freshman here at Haldane this year, and she's having a terrific experience. My other 2 children, both of whom are in middle school, should they get the opportunity, could enter the halls of Haldane in a few years and be encircled by a full community of friends, thanks to the strong bonds that they've made as part of growing up in Phillipstown. All of that said, the reason I'm here tonight is that Garrison faces some pretty big challenges financially, both in 2022 and in the near future. As you know, this isn't a new issue for us. We had to ask our community for help last spring to fund our 2022-23 budget and prevent massive cuts with the tax override. Although our voters rejected our initial request for a 9.9% override, they came through in the second vote and gave us a 6.6% override. It took a huge effort on behalf of our entire school community to find a number that could win that second vote, including a pay freeze from our teachers and administrators and some difficult cuts made to programming. Obviously, Haldane also came through. We really appreciate that by extending the 4-year offer contract for all students currently enrolled at the same rate as we pay our other high school partner. This was really appreciated by our community and a great symbol of our longtime partnership and friendship. Although the final outcome of the override was successful, the process was gut-wrenching for our school community and our teachers and students especially. Because we had to publicly share what cuts would have to be made if the second override didn't pass and a contingency budget was adopted, we had many longtime staff and teachers who were told they would lose their jobs if the vote didn't pass. As a result, we had some talented staff leave our school due to this uncertainty, and unfortunately made a number of our valued and loved teachers and administrators have to suffer through a month of uncertainty whether they'd have a job this year. To put it bluntly, there will be no interest in Garrison in going out for another override anytime soon, nor does anyone think it would be successful. So with that in mind, I'd like to address the elephant in the room. Yes, Garrison's overall tax rate is lower than Haldane's. I completely understand the perspective of the community here that thinks that's unfair. The reality is that the tax rate is not something that can be changed with one vote, or even if we had a vote every year for a decade. Another thing I've heard from some people in Phillipstown is that we should merge our districts. And while that's certainly a compelling thing to discuss, it's not something that's likely to ever happen anytime soon, if ever. Topics like our tax rate or merging districts are theoretical discussions, and unfortunately, they have no bearing to what we're trying to solve right now. So we at the Garrison Board are focused on the challenges of today's budget. It consumes every discussion we have and every decision we make. Our tax base overall is really small. We're only a $10 million budget. So every dollar we put into our budget counts, and every unexpected expense is really challenging. We're currently faced with a number of those challenges. We actually received a decrease in state aid and BOCES aid last year. We aren't counting on that reversing really anytime soon. Our healthcare costs increased 8% last year. Our transportation expenses are nearly double now what they were pre-pandemic. We've had to draw down our fund balance pretty significantly to help pay for the necessities that happened during the pandemic and also just to pay off some of these increasing costs. So, budgeting choices we have had to and will continue to have to make for our K-8 students reflect this reality. We are running a really tight ship. We only have one section per K-8 class, with the exception of a gigantic kindergarten class this year, which is great, but certainly not possible to do a 32-kid kindergarten class. And our substantial 8th grade class that also has different math cohorts. So as a result, our elementary and middle school class sizes are about 20% higher on average than they are here in this building. Our administration has also been very creative in finding different ways to maintain our educational experience. We employ artists and residents for our arts and music curriculum, which has been wildly successful. And they've also done a great job of consolidating many of the responsibilities on an administrative level to save the need for additional staff heads. But despite all this great expense management, we're still in a very difficult position and will be so for the near future. specifically for the reason I'm standing before you tonight. In addition to all these costs, we're going to see a huge increase in future years in the cost of our high school tuition, no matter what rate we're paying, due to a growing size of our high school age student population. We anticipate that we'll have nearly 90 high school students in the Garrison District by the 2024-25 school year. That's an increase of 23% from what it was last year. This coming challenge is why we've made it a priority to create arrangements, agreements with our high school partners and lock in long-term rates. We simply can't afford to have high school tuition be an unpredictable line item in our budget as we add more and more students in coming years. Not having a locked-in rate or negotiating agreements annually is just not sustainable for our school from a budget point of view. And that's why we're asking Haldane to agree to the same terms as our other high school partner. I hope I've made it clear why going year to year for Garrison is impossible for us, planning on such small margins and unpredictable budget factors. But really, for me, the more important reason to come to a deal is for our parents and students. Garrison's a unique place. It's one of few that offers high school choice. It's a key characteristic to the educational experience for our students and something we plan to continue to offer. It'll be really hard for us to do so with Haldane unless we know our future fixed costs and know we can afford that partnership. We owe it to our community and our students to put in place a long-term deal, take this question off the table, and create security for our students who are currently considering their choices. I do want to address the NRT, non-resident tuition rate. So I've made clear we need a rate that's locked in for a number of years that meets our budgetary needs. And that means accepting a non-resident tuition rate formula is really challenging for us. First, the NRT rate isn't something we know in advance. In fact, it comes in halfway through the following year after students are already attending classes. For example, if Garrison students were paying Haldane the NRT rate this year, we wouldn't know what that rate is until this coming January, when we need to budget 10 months earlier. On the extremely tight budget in the small district we had, we simply are unable to manage this way. Second, NRT is a reflection of spending on students and state aid awarded, not necessarily the incremental cost of each student. We're familiar with this concept in Garrison, as we, for the first time in years, started accepting non-resident students this year. We don't charge nearly the full NRT rate because we recognize the economies of scale make the tuition that we do accept for out-of-district students a great value for our district and our community. From that perspective, we believe that the incremental addition of 60 or so Garrison students to the Haldane High School population and the tuition that it brings, even at a negotiated rate, is a very positive thing financially for Haldane. I don't think anyone would dispute that, especially as our high school population continues to swell through the middle part of this decade. Financial issues aside, Garrison students are much more than line items in a budget. They're an important part of this community. Garrison student population in Haldane not only adds to the school's academics, athletics, and arts excellence, but also allows the school to offer programs that may not be possible without the addition of 60 to 70 students to the high school population. Raising your overall student population definitely lifts the Haldane experience. So at the end of the day, what's most important to me and the rest of the Garrison board is the experience of our kids. And clearly, we believe that keeping them at Haldane and codifying our relationship for years to come is the best thing we can do, not only for Garrison students, but for Haldane students as well. Garrison kids attending Haldane is good for everybody. It's good for Garrison, it's good for Haldane, and it's good for Phillipstown. It keeps our community bond strong. That said, whether or not we come to an agreement with Haldane, we are committed to offering high school choice. We have other potential new partners that have committed to offering the terms that meet our budgetary challenges. Myself and the Garrison board are asking Haldane to make a similar agreement to extend our partnership on terms we firmly believe are beneficial to us both. Thank you again for the opportunity to come and speak with you and share our perspective from Garrison, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Great, thank you so much for coming. Phil, if you want to come back up.
Yeah, so Ken, if you wouldn't mind staying, I'm just going to present
Sure.
some constructs for our contract, and we'll go from there. So as Ken had shared, last year's budget situation with Garrison was somewhat unanticipated, and I don't know, there you are, somewhat unanticipated, and it created this dynamic where we were discussing tuition rates during our budget development process as well. And as we agreed to, we established parameters for a locked-in tuition rate for the current cohort of students who are here. Hey, Megan, I don't have the clicker. Would you mind? Oh, you're going to click for me. Thank you so much. So I just want to provide some background information on the current agreement that we have, which exists for students who are currently in 9th through 12th grade here at Haldane. Before I get into this, I'd be remiss if I didn't circle back to a couple of things that Ken had shared, which was one to reiterate the value for the relationship that we have with our Garrison students now. We consider them Haldane students and their families. That's something that's very important to us and something we've come to appreciate not only recently, but it sounds like for probably 100 years or so. Second, Peggy, Sean, and I met with the Garrison leadership a couple of weeks ago. It really stemmed from a discussion that Mr. Albano and I had, which was to try to address this matter sooner, so it didn't carry into budget development process. That's good for Garrison, that's good for Haldane, seems to be good for all. As Ken had shared, these are students that we're talking about and families, and we want to make sure that we're providing some sense of certainty for what is in place for the upcoming school year, not just from a budgeting perspective, but for the students who are impacted by this or potentially impacted by it. So with that in mind, and we did state that we would try to arrive at try to bring this to closure by the end of this month if we could. We have a meeting tonight, we have another meeting next week, and that would offer plenty of time for the board to discuss this matter. Garrison's ask, if you will, is to basically continue the agreement that we have in place right now for students in successive years. So 8th grade students that are at Garrison now, and for whatever duration Haldane is comfortable with for groups that may come behind that group of students. So we currently charge the tuition for this school year is set at $16,495. As Ken alluded to, this is the rate, the lower of the two NRT rates between us and O'Neill High School. In subsequent years, under our current agreement, tuition will increase by either the CPI or 2%, whichever is less. For the time being, this is likely to be 2%, and that's for students who are entering grade 9 this school year. Or for students who are entering grade 9, we have to renegotiate the terms and conditions of this, whether it be an extension of this agreement or something else. Garrison agrees to pay for any additional tuition, related service expenses, and all other costs for students who are placed in out-of-district programs by the Committee of Special Education. In our previous agreement, we had a tiered structure for special education costs. That was determined by the extent of the programmatic needs that were listed for each student. We shifted that to charging the same tuition rate for general education students, unless special education students are placed in out-of-district programs. Garrison assumes the cost for those students, as well as, again, as the related service expenses that those students may receive. Megan, if you can transition to the next slide. This is an overview of the non-resident tuition rate structure. As Ken alluded to, we don't know the non-resident tuition rate for this school year. We won't know that for a few months' time. You can also see the NRT rate against what Haldane actually charged Garrison. We went back to 16-17 for purposes of tonight's conversation. We felt this offered enough perspective. In years prior to 16-17, it hovered right around that $13,000 mark. And you can see in any given year, the rate can jump quite significantly. So if you look from 18-19 to 19-20, the NRT rate jumped about $2,500 per student. We also saw a significant increase from 2021 to 21-22, going from 18,600 to 20,400. Now, this is compounded to a degree if you look at what the actual rate was that we were charging Garrison at those times. This is what Garrison would have been alluding to as a significant fiscal stress that they were assuming as they were planning for this school year, as it relates to what they had been paying in 2021 to what potentially we were moving towards in the NRT rate north of $20,000. And again, the negotiated rate for this year is listed there at $16,495. This is just a different visual of the same information. The NRT rate is the dark blue bar. The actual rate that we negotiated with Garrison is the light blue bar. We decided, just for purposes of discussion tonight, to demonstrate what the NRT rate is in other districts. Caveat here, these districts may not even have policy that allows for non-resident students to attend their schools. I didn't look that up. That would be dictated by board policy. But it just gives you some perspective on districts that we consider similar in size and how those NRT rates can vary. Also how they have varied over years in any given district, sometimes taking perceived more significant jumps than other years, which is all determined by formula, an SED formula that's established. So you can see with respect to Haldane's rate, we're higher than some districts, we're lower than others. This is an overview of our current enrollment, 22-23 being the current school year at the top row there. We currently have 53 Garrison students attending our school this year. You can get a sense here in the previous school years how that has ranged, not only by class, but also by total cohort. Generally, we enjoy having more Garrison students here this year than we have in the previous 5 school years. Looking ahead, just against the current contract that's in place, these are the students who are under the terms and conditions, who are attending Haldane under the terms and conditions of the current agreement, and then how this could potentially shift over in each successive year of the agreement. So it's our current 9 through 12 cohort and how that enrollment group is shifting in terms of size in the over the next 3 school years. Got a couple of questions just in anticipation of tonight's conversation, and again, some caveats to these questions. So, and then we'll turn it over to the board for further discussion. And if you have any questions for Kent, I know Kent would be happy to answer some questions as well. So how much does it cost to educate a student in Haldane? So it's a bit of a loaded question in that I'll say there's different ways to look at this. That being said, if you were to look at the methodology under the Every Student Succeeds Act, so if you were to go to our school report card, there is an actual per pupil cost that is generated, that SED generates for our school district. And the formula or the variables that they're looking at in our district budget and how they arrive at a per pupil cost is all listed there. So if you were to look at their methodology, our cost per student is $26,900 in the 2021 school year. I'm sorry, there's a bit of a typo there. There's always a lag in that SED data. So this is the most current data you can look, that whose methodology is the same across all districts in New York State. So if you were interested in saying, well, how does Haldane calculate, or what's Haldane's cost versus any other school district's cost, you can refer to the state ed website, the school report cards, and they'll give you these costs. That's not to say, though, that our NRT rate matches these costs. If we were to go back a few slides, you would see in the 2020-2021 school year, our NRT rate was less than $26,000, $26,902. But if you wanted to compare districts, you could do so. I'll just note the county average was $28,000 per student. So this is a reference point I've made in some of our budget development processes, and usually in comparison to other county schools. So here we have it again, just for a point of reference. Next slide, Meg. Who provides transportation for Garrison students who attend Haldane? Garrison still assumes the costs and responsibilities associated with transportation for our students. And can other out-of-district students attend Haldane, and if so, at what cost? So we actually have policy that relates to this. It's policy 7132. The answer is yes. Other out-of-district students can attend Haldane with the approval of the Board of Education. We've been in a couple of times over the years where we've had a parent petition the district to allow their child to attend Haldane for a variety of reasons. We review those matters with the board. And generally, over the past couple of years, I can only speak to, we have allowed those students to attend. They do pay the full non-resident tuition rate.
So what's the full resident? As opposed to, so that would be different than the one that the Garrison students are under in the current
Correct.
contract?
It's the rate, the last rate that we have is
NRT
$20,400 or so for this school year. So those were a few questions that I had received prior, so those are for the board. And we can open up for further discussion and questions. I'm just going to take my seat so you have a microphone to yourself, Ken. Thank you.
Thank you again for coming, and I was quite generous, I think, of the board officers from the Garrison Union to send you over here. They said that you would do a wonderful job of representing
They
them.
volunteered.
I've been here a few times before, so
Yes,
I
and
kind of
so-
knew where I was going.
So thank you so very much for doing it, and for, I think, accurately representing, what our takeaway from that conversation was. So thank you for your time and for so generously speaking about your own personal experience here with your family in the district. Peggy and I had the opportunity to ask some questions, so before I launch, and I'd like to turn it over to the members of the board who weren't in that small meeting. If you have any questions, and I'm sure that you do. Looks like John. I see that. I see.
I'll toss it in. Okay. Thank you for coming and being the point of the sword for things that we're going to ask you. First, having Garrison students attend Haldane is fantastic, right? I fully believe the community aspect of all of us participating in, whether it's Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts or Phillistown Rec, absolutely great. I also recognize your interest, your really strong interest in budget security, budget consistency over time. Totally get that. One of the benefits of attending Garrison, as you mentioned, and one of the ones that you want to be able to continue, is to provide school choice, which is great. A question that I have is, I understand that you're looking to all of your potential high school partners for consistency and budget consistency based on the number of students you have. I guess my question is, and so we would be guaranteeing that to you, right, through some sort of, again, what's the reciprocal guarantee from Garrison?
Our guarantee would continue to offer Haldane as a choice.
So that's interesting because it ends up being a choice, right? So we saw those numbers of students that come to Haldane, and as much as we don't like to talk about dollars per kid, it's dollars per kid. And while we would be guaranteeing you consistency of your tuition into the future, we wouldn't be guaranteed any tuition. We could have a year when every single student chooses to go to O'Neill or Lakeland or pick your school. So we are similarly facing a challenge of a budget gap in a year where we may not reap the benefits of students deciding to come to. So what's the trade, I guess is?
I guess we're not going to commit to exclusive to one school, so
Right.
I'm not able to offer you a guaranteed number of students per year.
Yeah,
I can continue to offer you the ability for our students to come here.
yeah.
And we've talked about in the past, if you guys have ideas about if you want to figure out ways in which to balance out the budgeting each year and have a merged average, change the way that we pay each other, or that we pay our tuition rather than on an annual basis, I'm sure we'd be certainly open to talking about that. But for right now, we're not going to change our high school choice program
Right.
and have an exclusive with one school.
Yeah, and I don't think it's even about exclusivity. It's about we're sacrificing guaranteed revenue for your guaranteed cost. And we don't even have guaranteed revenue at this point. We just
We have dedicated ourselves to making our students make that choice earlier in the year,
Yeah.
before the budgeting process happens. In the past, they would choose in March after the budgeting process, when it was truly just an unknown what you would get.
right.
So we are doing that. We are making them make that choice by the end of the year, so you will know, for a budgeting point of view, what you'll be getting each year.
Yeah, that's certainly beneficial. Second question I had was on the lower of the CPI or 2%. What's the average budget to budget increase for Garrison?
It's in the 2 to 3% range at the tax cap.
Okay.
So
All right, so that's fair. So if it's lower and will tend to be 2%, am I thinking correctly that over time, tuition as a percentage of the Garrison budget will actually get smaller as compared to your total budget, because it will likely be 2%, but your budget will be going up at 2.5 to 3,
And adjusted change CPI, yeah.
right?
yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point to make,
Okay.
and certainly one that we
That
could
would be
discuss.
something I'd want to consider
Yep.
about, how do we share the
Yeah, I'm not aware how
benefits?
we came to 2%, but that's certainly a good point.
Yeah, I think it's just 2% is a number that seems to be used quite extensively in New York State, right?
It's shorthand for.
Right. So, and again, the basis of the contract development last year for this year was consistency, and obviously there's a variability that comes in with CPI.
Yeah.
And 2% establishes a consistent rate increase each year as an acknowledgement that costs are increasing. Granted, some costs are increasing at a higher rate than that.
I think our average tax cap was in the even below 2% range over the last 10 years.
I think they are. I don't think, I think that would make sense to me.
I got two numbers, if I can go. You may have these, or you may not. What is Garrison? So, Dr. Benante was, put up effectively Haldane's number on a cost per pupil. What is Garrison's
It's
cost per
higher.
pupil?
That particular study, I know that it's higher than Haldane. Between an NRT rate and that particular formula, I know it's higher, significantly higher.
So your Garrison number is higher than Haldane's number, not just an NRT rate.
Yes.
And then you're asking for a significant
That's correct.
discount. Okay. And then, second number, you have, so currently right, which is great, we have 53 students from Garrison.
Which I actually thought that number was higher, so I apologize, quoted
I
60.
think the freshman year, it may be a bit higher, so it might actually be 50.
There were a number of students from Manitou, I think, that came as well. So.
Okay, well, let's sit with
Sure.
60. What percentage of that is the overall students of
Right now, it's
Garrison that
about
are at that age group?
2/3 Haldane, 1/3 O'Neill.
Okay.
But that changes on a yearly basis. I mean, the legacy of having the two schools is that you have families. Like my guess is that maybe this year's class will be a little more heavily toward O'Neill, knowing some of the families who have siblings at O'Neill and those type of things. But it's generally about 2/3, 1/3.
Kent, do you happen to know what's the current size of the 8th grade cohort at Garrison?
I think it's 27 or 28.
And I think it was right around 30 or 31 last year,
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken, and we had approximately 18 students. I think we showed 16 here, but the
Yeah.
Manitou piece, I think we may have missed that, and that we showed 16 here, but it's actually 18 students attended from Haldane. But as you noted, and perhaps reflected in previous slides, the number really has varied in previous years. There was a year, I think it was as low as 9 we showed there. Last year was one of the higher.
Yeah, the population varies too.
It does,
Right?
yep.
Cohorts switch,
Yep.
so that's why I'm just asking for percentages.
Got it.
But as I noted,
Overall.
our cohorts are large in middle school right now. They're all in the high 20s. And so this is much higher than it has been in the past few
Certainly
years.
showing up on the modified boys soccer team.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, there's my numbers. That's it.
Well, and, to that overall cost per student number, there's another number, right, with the special education student? Isn't that a separate number?
So in last year's negotiation, we agreed to establish the special education costs as the same as the general education costs for students who are attending Haldane. If a student's placed in an out-of-district program, Garrison assumes the cost for their placement in that program.
But I mean, overall, the Haldane's overall cost per student, which you just had up there, 26,000.
Right.
Isn't it a different price for special education?
Generally, yeah. I'm sorry, Maggie. That is not listed in the same ESSA financial transparency report. So I didn't have a cost to present this evening as it related to that, but we can certainly assume our cost per student for special education is higher.
And again, there's some, differences in those numbers when we talk about this, the number, the $26,000 overall cost per student, and then the NRT rate.
Right.
And it's generally a little bit lower. But, can you just sort of, for the benefit of Haldane School District taxpayers, how do you explain that this is what it costs, this is our average cost to educate Haldane students, that, we're asking, or Garrison's asking us to pay?
Sure, I won't. It's an agreed upon rate that the board's agreed to for at least since 2012. It likely goes on much longer than that. My documents in my office go back as far as 2012 as it relates to it. I think there's been years where it's trended closer to the NRT rate. And we're at a point for a variety of factors that it isn't trending as closely. I'll say this, though, just some other math. If you were to look at what Garrison was paying in 2016-17, it was about 80% of the NRT costs. And if you were to look at what Garrison's paying this year, it's about 80% of the NRT costs. So I won't say that's been the contract is not structured on a percentage of NRT rate, obviously. It just so happens that I was looking at it a little differently in preparation for today, and it seems that generally Garrison this year is paying the same percentage or a rate that they've paid in years past. But the rate varies from year to year. So you can see where, well, one year it might be 85 and another year it might be 75. But
it's a reflection of spending. Your NRT rate is going to go up because you've received more state aid last year and you spent more money this year. So there's no doubt that number will go up. And that's something that, as far as a Garrison resident, we don't obviously have any say over that. So that's partially why we receive a decrease in state funding. We're spending less.
Right.
We're doing our best, but we have no control over that.
I think the agreements symbolize, and again, I don't have the history of each Board of Education and each administration across two districts, no less. The agreement, though, does signify that at some point there was an understanding between the two districts that a separate arrangement from the NRT rate was going to be established. Otherwise, it just would be the NRT rate, right? So, and again, I don't know the stories behind that. I don't know, at what point we came to do so, but at least for the last, dozen years, there's some agreement between the districts that this is a unique relationship, and we're establishing, there's an exchange of service in this regard, and it necessitates something different than what the state formula establishes.
I think it's fair. And, listening to Kent a little bit earlier, talking about, unpredictables, and you don't know your future fixed costs. I mean, we don't know our future fixed costs either. And I mean, just to play that, that percentage of the population that's gonna ask about this, it just seems so difficult. I think there's room for discussion on a per year basis and see what comes up and what, for the next school year. But I think to enter into any type of fixed contract would be pretty irresponsible for the Haldane district taxpayers, just because we don't know what's coming down the pike. We could have this huge capital project that may or may not be coming to fruition. So, I just wanted to, it's a catch-22. I see you on the side of the now it's going to be the basketball court. It's hard, but it's
now I
and the
understand
softball field and the baseball field. But it's hard. It's a thing that transcends our history, your history, my history at time period with this school district for sure. But it's different property taxes assessed differently and different things. Where I pay double in some cases for my postage stamp size yard, than you guys down. And I know there's that argument that festers, and it's going to be really hard to, and it's got value. That argument has a lot of value for certain taxpayers. So anyway, I just wanted to.
No, and I appreciate, like I said, and I understand that. It's not something we can change. I will point out, I do believe the cost for educating each student is not the same for Garrison students. There's no transportation involved. And the incremental cost for adding whatever population we have certainly does not cost each one of those students. If we extracted our students from this, your cost would go up significantly, or you'd have to make cuts. And nobody wants that. As a Phillips Sound resident, I don't want that. But we're really pushed financially against the wall a little bit. And the unpredictability makes it very, very difficult for us, especially given the challenges we faced last year and we will certainly face this year.
Ken, a question, and this came up in all fairness in our discussion with the board, or with representatives from the board a couple weeks ago. The value of the relationship is something I heard you state, and I know is important to us as well. And you also, though, alluded to potentially exploring other options to expand choice. And Why is that necessary?
We're dedicated to offering high school choice, and because we don't control what decision you all will make as far as what tuition you'll offer us, if we can't afford it, we have to look elsewhere to do that.
I heard a causal relationship in there that I'm gonna push on. So it's a if, then.
That's something we're discussing at our meeting tomorrow night, which you're all welcome to attend. I'm sure you have nothing better to do. It is something that will be on our agenda tomorrow night.
Okay. So here, I'll throw out 2 points that you can not answer on behalf of the board, because you probably not, I wouldn't want you to. But if we were able to enter into a relationship that guaranteed tuition stability, and there were a structure to guarantee us revenue stability while maintaining school choice, would that be acceptable to you?
I certainly think that would be something that we would
Or at least
very much
acceptable
like
to
to
explore.
discuss and explore.
Second question, if we were able to enter into a relationship that provides what we mutually provide, would you take off the table anytime during that term of that contract your ability to add incremental high school choice during that term?
I mean, it's certainly a point. Like you said, I won't be able to answer on behalf of the
Yep.
board right now, but
Okay.
I take your point, and I will take that back to
Yeah, that's
to my colleagues.
And it was my understanding, I believe that our current agreement for 4 years, there is room for it to be extended 1 additional year to 5, but we can only enter into agreements that are
Our
in
attorney
4
was
years.
looking into how that could be modified. So in order to extend, I don't know if you know, this is something I learned last year, in order to create a more than 2-year agreement, our district, we have to put it in front of our voters. Our voters did approve a 5-year deal with you last year. So our attorney was looking into whether if we came to an agreement, we could simply modify those terms and not have to go back in front of the voters or not. So I don't know the answer to that.
You don't know the answer, by the way. Okay. Right. Go ahead.
So I'm actually gonna, so everything that folks on this board have said about what we understandably perceive to be the concerns that our Haldane taxpaying constituents have, I agree with all of those. But I would like to shift the conversation just a little bit. And I wish I thought to give you a chance to think about this in advance. But, so I just did some quick math, and I'm remembering from last year. So like 56 students times $16,450 is over $900,000. It's close to $1 million. I remember that from last year. So that, while I don't, that purchases program for our high school. And I don't know exactly, I mean, I just think this is an important piece for us to consider in all of it. And I would assume that if we were to end our agreement with Garrison and that amount of money decreased over a number of years, that, am I correct in thinking that that's a burden that the high school would primarily bear? I mean, I know we'd have to think about that. I mean, because this is how, let me just tell you how I've been thinking about it since we talked to Garrison. I was like, well, that's like a meaningful amount of money. That's got to buy 3 or 4 people, that's got to pay the salaries of 3 or 4 people when you think about benefits and, everything like that. And I was like, well, what impact would that have on our high school program? And it seemed to me like it could be a potentially big impact on our high school program. And I just think that's something that I would like to have a better understanding about. And maybe it's too much looking into the future and we can't know, but I don't think it's insignificant to point out that's a meaningful amount of money and it represents people and it represents high school program. And I just think that's something that we need to keep in mind.
I would amend that a hair, Phil.
Oh, that would be great, yeah.
So your terminology, so if we take Kent at what he stated, and the guy sends his kids here too, that's not really, remember, that's not just like Haldane, Cold Spring high school students, right? That's our high school students. So the issue that I have in the frame of the conversation, and John has pointed it out, where you say we, meaning Cold Spring Haldane, is going to lose $1 million. Well, I look at it and I say, well, actually, Kent's daughter is out $1 million, right? Off of an experience at Haldane. And so when John says, hey, I feel like there's a little bit of a cudgel here where you're saying, we're going to walk away and we want this choice and there's no guarantee back to us. I find it, it's a little bit problematic, right? Because we see the $1 million and the way I see it is these are our kids, right? We're all in this together. And the concept of saying, well, if you don't meet these certain criteria, then we're going to pull that money out. That's a little problematic, right? So don't answer that question, Kent. Just recognize, because you don't want to answer for the board, but
My only point would be that
you got to realize that, right? And putting that in a position is difficult.
we're in a position where we are being offered by other high schools that rate. So
Yeah, but your daughter goes here.
like
if
I
this
said,
means-
there's nobody in
this
this room that
means-
wants this to
exactly.
continue more than me.
And if this means, this is our school, these are our children, right? And then the idea to then say, well, our kids could jump to, X, Y, and Z. It seems a little.
It's more of a question of protecting ourselves. We can't afford an NRT rate. We simply cannot afford it. So we're coming to you and saying, we are able to get a rate that we can afford. We're asking that you match the rate because we're longtime partners. If you can't match it, I'm not sure our budget process will allow us to continue our relationship. It's really comes down to that more than anything else. And it's heartbreaking to me. It's gut-wrenching to me.
Right.
But we don't have levers to create extra money to pay Haldane more than our other high school partners.
Ken, if I just go back to the conversation we had with the leadership of Garrison, it's not so much Garrison's drivers in this aren't also just thinking about their high school students as trying to maintain a certain level of programming for your K through 8 students.
It's got to come out of there. We don't have any other
So
place to get it.
the impact, you're not only thinking of the impact, and we heard this from their leadership, not only of the students who attend here or who could potentially attend here, it's the impact on their K-8 group as well. And Ken spoke to some of the discussions or some of the impact that even going through last year's budget development process had on losing less senior staff who are concerned about stability and such, and reducing programs. So I think that's a factor in their budget discussion that is
We have very few levers to pull
Right.
to create extra revenue. So that is truly the impetus for all of this is a budgeting exercise. It is no more than that. Nobody in the room wants this to continue more than me. So this is, that said, we couldn't go out for a vote to pay for extra money to send your way because that would never pass.
What?
We have our community, I think, in looking at our voter roll, our school community is extremely small. And those that are extremely active are the K through 8 parents. Or a third of those parents, they go to a different high school. It's not a very large voting block. It might be enthusiastic, but it's not large enough to send a 2/3 victory on an override. And like I said, last year and I hope you all never have to go through that experience. It was very, very painful for our community. And so we're focused on figuring out a way to make it work, and we'll continue to do that.
Financially, to circle back, it's $900,000. It's a lot of money, and it would have a direct impact on not only our high school students. I think on depending on how you resolve a potential gap like that, you're resolving where there may be opportunity to realize reduced cost. So that's not just on our high school.
Right.
I also think that when we look at our high school, one of the advantages of our high school is the nature of its size. It's a small high school. We have extensive offerings relative to our size.
Yeah, no, that's what I was thinking
Right,
about.
that could potentially be impacted. It's 54 or so students that go to or attend our high school out of 300. So it's a sixth or so. It's about 16 to 17% of our high school population. I think when it comes to, we talk about this sometimes with our small class sizes, there is a time that even if we're able to maintain those instructional programs, which I know we would make every effort to do so, I sometimes worry you want there to be a substantive class for the activities and the discussions that's occurring at a classroom level. And not just that our Garrison students in any way are just filling seats and whatnot, but losing 50 plus students from our high school would, I think, have a direct impact on, putting reductions aside, on the nature of what's occurring in our classroom environments on a day-to-day basis.
And while I appreciate the point that Ezra was making about like there are kids, definitely, I'll be honest,
Good point.
in thinking about that, I'm actually thinking about the kids that are at Haldane right now, K through 8, and the impact. I think it's important for us to also be mindful that losing $1 million over the course of 4 years, which is what would happen if we didn't have an agreement. And I'm not saying I'm like pro agreement. I just think it should be, they're not there, that losing $1 million over the course of 4 years will have some kind of programmatic, I think it's safe to say will have some kind of programmatic impact on the high school experience of the children that are at Haldane K through 8 right now. And I've thought about this a lot.
Wait, the K through 8 students?
Yeah,
Why?
because they'll be going to Haldane in a few years. So to be specific, like every K through 8 kid, Haldane kid right now is who's going to go to Haldane High School. They will go to a high school that has $1 million left. This is all.
Well, yeah, $1 million, we don't know that's what it's going to be.
But
in
about,
however many years.
it's something, and I
different
think,
from every year. And they're not able to give us
Right.
the exact amount of kids every year, so.
right. I am not advocating anything right now. I'll be honest, I've thought about this a lot in the past couple of years. My child benefited enormously from having like lots and lots of AP math and science classes. And he took AP physics too. There were 6 kids in that class. That was the best class for Peter ever. That was the class, and I'm not saying, we don't know what the impact would be. We don't know what classes would get cut. We don't know what kinds of staff, we don't know what would happen, but I think it's safe to say that something would happen to our program, and I just want to speak that.
Yeah, $1 million is roughly 3%
Of our budget?
of our budget.
Yeah, a little north of 3.
Right, it's 3%.
Mhm.
So think about not passing a budget
Right, that's exactly right. Yeah.
that year, a year,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So you talk about that.
It's crazy for me to say this because I think in conversations with people, I've been one of the people who's been as vocal as anybody else, sort of not being excited about the position that we're in with this, with this situation. So, I'm not, I really want to be clear, I'm not advocating for anything. I just think it's important for us to, that's it.
Well, I was very moved, I think, by what Ezra is saying about our kids, and I feel like one of the things I think we all are taking for granted, or as a given here, is that, every Garrison student that's here is a Haldane student, and we care about them deeply, and that there are a few opportunities that we as a board get to talk about that relationship in a meaningful way, and that we are focused on the finances right now is out of necessity, and I appreciate everybody's candor and the questions everyone's asked about it. I will say, as a person, I feel a responsibility to those community members who don't have students in the district, but as a parent of a child in the district, speaking solely on that, I feel like, we benefit immensely from the relationship overall outside, programmatically, but also what every student brings into those programs. So the ability that we have to provide it is as meaningful as who gets to participate in that program in one way or another. And, we value them both in the classroom and as extracurricular wise as well. And also echo what Peggy said is that I think the most that I heard during the conversation that before it became public last year from other parents was about how their child was looking forward to having the students come from Garrison into the 9th grade and what that meant to the transformation of the culture as a result of that. And I think that's a benefit that we should absolutely highlight in the conversation as much as we should be about our fiscal responsibility. I just feel like it's important for us to say that as we talk about the finer points of what we owe each other. I also wanted to thank Phil for scaling what the change that has occurred over the past 4 or 5 years in the tuition, and that it is in fact going up. We don't at least see it being stagnant. And there was a moment there before COVID happened when we were sort of cheerily and merrily going hand in hand towards something that felt closer to NRT, and we can't go back in time. That was.
Before I became on the board, that was one of the things you were talking about, is raising that NRT rate.
And it's a sort of it's an inherited kind of conversation that's gone on for multi-generations, before many of us have. So I would like to put that into the room since something that hasn't been stated openly.
Just to come back to that last point, that was something that between Garrison and Haldane, between me and Mr. Albano, when we first discussed transitioning the rate, was an easy conversation until such time when the constructs of the finances of the district, didn't allow for it. And it's understood that happens. The state aid did not come to every district in the same way. And so I think it's reflective that at that point in time, Garrison was understanding that the rate did not reflect, the cost, whatever the real cost is, if we can arrive at that, and an understanding of a move in that direction until such time it became, as we hear it, they're no longer able to afford it without significantly impacting the other programs that they have at the school.
I'm just going to throw something out just for anybody who's watching, and because we've mentioned state aid and our benefit and the negative change to Garrison. The reason why state aid changes is because of wealth ratio of the community.
Correct.
And the reason why Garrison's went down is not because the state doesn't like you any less or likes us more. Right. It's because you live in a wealthier district. And so I think to echo some of the things that Maggie has brought up, is like there is this feeling that has existed, I think probably for longer than I've lived here.
Probably before kids came from Garrison.
Probably before any kids, right? That there's a relative wealth disparity between the two communities, and the reverse is true on the taxation. So that is in sort of a facts on the ground or perceptions on the ground that we need to be able to understand and speak to.
But also, John, we're not a state money wealthy
No,
school.
neither compared to.
So the fact that, we're talking, we didn't, get cuts. It's not like we have a large percentage of our budget is provided by the state either, because not for nothing, we're also a wealthy district.
Absolutely.
Less so. But still, it's privilege versus privilege at some level. So, but let's also get that out there that, yes, your loss to state funding is very hurtful in your district, but we don't have particularly a large source of state money. No. Right? And so at some level, that's a point for you, to also be able to keep in mind that it's not, the vast majority of this budget is paid for by our local taxpayers who have been paying increased taxes for decades in comparison to Garrison. Right? And so it's an ask, right? And they sent the right guy to ask it, believe me, man. But it's a significant ask. And then to go back and then suggest that Putnam Valley or other school districts let's have their taxpayers cover this cost at a lower rate. That's also an interesting question. How long does that take to fester at that point? And then would you have the same conversations that you have with us, which is this is a great, meaningful relationship. But then all of a sudden, would you have that same conversation somewhere else? Well, this is a great, meaningful relationship. And then this is a great, meaningful relationship. And I don't mean to be negative about it, but there is a lot of discussion on this board about maintaining Garrison students here. And I know that that's reciprocated at some level, but you need to understand that there is a huge conversation of, these are our students, right? And when, at some level, the comeback is, yeah, they're your students, kind of, but they could be, they could be somewhere else, too. That's like, wow, we're spending a lot. Feels like we're putting a lot of emotional and financial energy into having these be our students, right? So just be very, very mindful of that.
I appreciate that, and
Some perspective.
again, I have a daughter here, so
I know, you're the guy.
You're the coach.
I'm
You
not
are
I'm not an
leading for a
unbiased
reason.
party, but I would say the act of what we're doing is just trying to protect ourselves in some way. Like if we can't afford to pay you, we need to figure out how we still offer school choice to our kids. So other high schools have come and been very enthusiastic about the idea of adding our students. I do believe, like I said in my statement, that the incremental cost of each student is not the NRT rate. It adds, I think what Sean and Peggy said is true. You're able to offer a much more robust program with the addition of our students. So I would just urge you to take all of that into consideration, and I very much, Ezra, appreciate your thoughts and feelings on that, and I share them.
Great. All right. Again, thank you so much. Really.
I'm just
really,
glad
truly.
I get to go home and don't have to stay the rest of the meeting. So,
Host your own meeting.
yes,
Okay, great.
And by the way, thank you for being on the board.
thank you.
Appreciate it.
It is School Board Appreciation Week. I don't know if you were aware of that.
Where was my email?
Where's my cookies?
Where's
So-
Where's my
Everybody
present?
knows that we
Where's
do
my
this for
t-shirt?
full
Okay.
coffee.
Thanks so much. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. All right. So, just so everyone knows, Dr. Benante didn't decide that that was the end and he's just leaving the district. He's just going to do the kind thing and walk our guest out. So, but he's assured me that we can move on, so that's what I'm going to do. Next up is our communication from the public. Since we have no public here, I'm going to spare everybody reading the long paragraph here. Moving into information reports. Yeah. I don't.
I got it.
You got it?
Thank you.
Thank you, of course.
That's a new screen.
It is. Moving into information reports. These are here for your review for our next meeting. And now going into consent agenda minutes. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Second. Any discussion? No? All right, all those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? No? Great. All right, moving into consent agenda personnel. May I have a motion, please?
So moved. I think you skipped financial.
How does that keep happening? Consent agenda financial, may I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? No? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? No? Now, moving on to consent agenda personnel. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? No? I'm sure Dr. Benante might have something he'd like to say here. We are on to consent agenda personnel. Is there anything that you would like to say?
If there's anything. Sean?
Mm-hmm.
No.
All right, all those in favor? Any opposed? All right.
Oh, I didn't say aye, but
I
meant
said aye.
Throwing my
I was thinking, I was thinking.
Good. Pause for the Vice President's thoughts. And moving on to unfinished business. First on here is our Board of Education goals, which are attached. Ms. Shields?
Be it resolved that upon the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools, the Board of Education hereby adopts the Board of Education goals for the 2022-2023 school year as presented.
May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second?
All right. Any discussion? We've been working on these for a while now. I don't know if everyone had a chance to review them.
Yes. So the second goal, support the district's identification of areas of focus from the school climate survey, et cetera. What is the next step? What is the timing on hearing, like, we got the email in our inbox, right, with the results, so what's sort of the?
You'll begin to, I'm sure, dig into those and see that the feedback is pretty extensive. And the one piece, an additional piece that's not included there are all the comments that were provided, which provide an additional layer, depth of information to the district. So we're working with this and have identified a few areas of focus, which we will share with the board. And that's through 2 levels, district and then also building. So the district areas of focus are something we're beginning to coalesce around. So I would envision at some point in the near future, I'll share those with the board and what some potential strategies are for us to improve in those areas. And then the board will, I'm sure, have thoughts around how to support us.
The building level is, so you said there was 2 areas of focus, district and building, so what's the building?
So the building principals are working with their building level data with a team of teachers or staff members in their building to further identify their goals and the specific strategies for improvement in those areas.
And we'll hear back from them on that as well.
Correct.
At some point. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Fine.
My only question was, can we take the word sufficiently out of goal 1? So it says, right now it reads, support a district campus master planning process that sufficiently aligns a district's vision and mission with its use of space. Can we just align
Yeah, I think
the
that's
district's
good.
vision and mission?
You don't want qualifiers in there?
I don't like qualifiers. And that specifically, exactly, just take it out.
Yeah,
and
sure.
And the only other thing, just as a point of clarification, on 3, when it says develop and agree, and I apologize for not getting these, I thought about these earlier, but I didn't email them to you. Develop and agree on legislative advocacy priorities for the board. I think it's useful to be explicit that these are board legislative advocacy priorities and not district or administration.
Great. Are there, if we approve these this evening, we can go in and amend that language without any thought?
Without amendment, yeah.
Yeah,
Just
great.
make that notation.
All right, great. Well, all those in, yeah, go ahead, Peggy.
The only thing is, I just think we'll want to, thanks very much. I think for that one in particular, for that about does developing and agreeing on legislative advocacy priorities, I mean, as well as monitoring the implementation of the newly funded enhanced instructional experiences, I want to figure out like what our process for doing those things are going to be, because they're all things that need to happen in, I mean, like everything, pretty much almost everything we do, in open meeting, and so I just don't, I think, I mean, they do, I think for us to meet our goals, we just want to be mindful about when those things will happen, because to some extent, I feel like 1 and 2, which are really sort of aligned with the district goals, we're supporting, and Dr. Benante and the staff sort of take the lead on sort of doing that work, and we're supporting, figuring out the best way to support. But the other 2, I feel like are like we're the actors in a way, and maybe I'm just making it. I don't know how to do either one of those things. I guess is maybe one of the things I'm saying.
I recall, I believe it was when we were discussing these with Phil, perhaps in our agenda prep meeting, we were talking about, as far as, for instance, legislative priorities are concerned, the possibility of setting up a separate committee that,
Oh, that's right.
in
God,
one way or another,
sorry.
to help us define
forgot.
locally and at the state level what priorities, if any, we might have. So there's a,
Okay.
a genuine and generous
right.
conversation happening at that level in one way or another.
No, thank you. I'm sorry, I forgot
And
that.
I was just going to say, as a suggestion, not certainly the only way to do this, but you could, monitor the implementation of newly funded enhanced instructional experiences. As part of the budget development process, it would be a natural segue to say, okay, as we begin to think about what we're going to do next year, let us give you a recap of the things we have funded in the past whatever key initiatives we signed over the last couple of years and give you a status on how the funding decisions that you have made previously have led to what we see now, right? 'Cause so that could be potentially a kickoff to this year's budgeting process. Not saying that we have time, space, or whatever, but that logically flows.
So will this largely be then a secondary process conversation, or do you think it requires some sort of edit or to be amended? No?
No. I was just, before we adopted the goals, I wanted to make sure I understood that we had a plan that we had a plan for fulfilling them, or at least acknowledging that, that we want to figure out, I guess what I'm saying, in adopting these goals, and I don't know if we've done this in the past, I would appreciate if periodically we would maybe even add to the agenda, sort of checking in with each other about the extent to which we
Yeah,
are
that
meeting
makes
these,
complete
because these, discussion about what our goals should be and discussion about the extent to which we're meeting our goals are all activities that need to take place in open meetings. And I want to
Correct.
make sure that we have a plan to include that on the agenda moving forward.
Great, thank you. All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? No, okay, just kidding. All right. Moving on to reflections on our board retreat. We met in the second half of our annual board retreat at Winter Hill and Garrison. I think among the other,
I think
oh my goodness, we got so buried in the board goals that I completely forgot we have district goals as well.
I don't know if that was buried. I mean, we're supposed to talk about them a bit. I think
I
it's
know.
fine for us to have a conversation about them.
sidetrack.
Well said. Ms. Shields.
Be it resolved that upon the recommendation of the superintendent of schools, the Board of Education hereby adopts the district goals for the 2022-2023 school year as presented.
May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Let's discuss.
I'd similarly pull out the sufficiently, but other than that.
Yeah, that's where it was borrowed from, so that's great.
I figured as much.
Any other discussion points? No? All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? No? Great. Now we'll have our reflections on the board retreat. As I was saying, among the other topics, we focused on largely board communication. I don't know, I think it was time well spent. I think one outstanding question for us to continue to think about, we can talk about it now, is when we had a desire to, I think, address how comments and questions brought up during our 2 dedicated public comment sessions might be addressed in public meeting thereafter, and whether or not we want to build that into the agenda, for instance, the second agenda, the next day or the next meeting, or we want to communicate out on the website any public comments on anything brought up in public in a public conversation. I don't know if it's something for us to necessarily resolve this evening, but I think it's a question for consideration. Right? Mm-hmm. Does anybody else have any other sort of thoughts from our retreat?
I mean, I thought the opportunity, just some of the exercises that we did gave us a chance to sort of, talk and get to know each other, and, in a setting that we don't usually, we have. And, being at Winter Hill is very pretty. It's very, how often, that's the only time I ever get to go there. It's nice to gather with people there.
I hate team building exercises. I felt like the first retreat,
We're doing
whatever.
trust falls next time.
Are you gonna fall off the table? No.
The gumdrop
I
thing we had to
hate
do a
that
few
stuff,
years
but-
ago.
We didn't do
they
any
make you do
trust
this.
falls, just so.
No, but I did find that we did an exercise where we took scenarios as a board member, somebody in the community, all these different scenarios, like how do you deal with that? How do you get back to the public? How do you report to the school? And I found that actually really useful, just to hear everybody's opinion on that, because sometimes I feel like I'm operating in a vacuum in this role that I am on the school board, and that sort of helped just to hear everybody's candid thoughts on those different scenarios.
I agree that was super
Useful.
useful.
Yeah.
It's interesting to understand what type of communication, just for the public. We did what type of communicator are you, kind of, which is interesting, right? And you sort of learn how other people ingest and think about information. But I thought that was very useful because it puts you in specifically gray situations where you're like, okay, should I be responding as a board member? Who among the administration should I notify about this issue, if at all? And I thought that was great. I thought that was really useful. Great.
Oh, wait, you took a breath.
I was going to say, I do think we should come back to, perhaps not at this meeting, but I did appreciate the thought that went into how do we make public.
Right.
Consider if I remember correctly, it was if there is a response that comes after some time, after some thought, because often someone will come to the board with a question or a concern that we may not either be able to address consistently as a board in the moment, or have the information to be able to address, but that an answer is eventually supplied to that person. They have asked it in public session. The answer comes privately. Correct. So how do we, as a board and as a district, make that answer more public so people who would gain the benefit of that knowledge? I thought that was a really good thing to think about, and I think the proposed solution of making it available as part of the agenda was a good suggested outcome. I don't know what we need to do I don't think we should decide it now, but I think that is something we should bring back up, perhaps like old business next time, and sort of to understand from a legal perspective, is this amenable? Could we actually technologically implement it? All that kind of stuff, and maybe we have some perspective on that next time we can sort of discuss.
Yeah, and I believe his name escapes me. It's Tom, right? Tom is who facilitates. Yeah, John. It rhymed. It was pretty close. It's good, right? John had referenced maybe it was a Wappingers, and he said he was going to get back to us about how they handle it on. So that might be another
That's great.
useful
Good.
instrument for us to think
Great.
about. Great. Now moving on to the campus master plan update. I believe that Dr. Benante will take that on.
Megan's going to pull up some slides.
Great.
I just want to revisit this with the board. Tom, Campus Master Plan, Tom.
Yes.
And Melissa will be back. Actually, Melissa will be taking next week's presentation. Tom was on campus today to meet with our Master Planning Committee. So next week, they will be presenting some new ideas or iterations of from the discussion that they had with the board last time. I think that so a question I've heard, scrap that. The CS Arch desires, and we engage them to create an aspirational vision for our campus design, considering our current needs, our projected needs, and then also our vision for student learning on campus. And they're trying to highlight in this iteration that they shared with you and the iteration they're going to share with you next week, the key areas that they feel require additional building on campus in order to address either those needs or those visionary aspects of our program for kids. As it relates to the current discussion, some of this centers around the high school. And as you're well aware, and the community is aware, the community made an investment in building that high school 18 years ago. And some of the thoughts that we're discussing now, or the issues we're discussing now, were similar issues that were discussed 18 years ago. And for a variety of factors, some of which I'm still learning more about, there were decisions to take off the table some components that we're now discussing putting back into the plan. And I would say from an aspirational perspective, I don't think that's an issue. The issue may come when it comes time to decide what to put before the community for a potential vote. But I just wanted to state that before we got into discussion tonight. One other piece is I've had some records from board meetings from around that time shared with me. They're in digital format. They're actually in podcast form. So as you can imagine, it's a bit of a lift to kind of get at the depth of discussion that was occurring at the board at the time. The great news is there's a record. There's actually a recording of conversation that was occurring, but pinpointing at which meeting and at what point in the meeting takes a bit of time. this is my invite that if anybody's looking for some podcasts to listen to on the way to work or their commute, I have a few podcasts to share and recommendations to make. No.
Just Malcolm Gladwell voiceover sometime in the middle?
No.
2X.
Yes, right. But that's going to take a little bit of time to really accurately reflect what discussions were occurring as it related to the high school at that point, and any particular points of relevance that may have to come into this conversation. I do sit with, and I'm saying this candidly just for discussion, I don't know how much it should matter for the aspirational reflection of this part of a project. I'm just not sure. I think it's always good to know our history and know the intricacies of that discussion, but as it relates to this end of the project, I'm not sure how much of that should get in the way of what we aspire different spaces on our campus to be. But it is relevant. It will be relevant at some point along the way. Some things, the building site locations, the potential building site locations are listed here. Just in further discussion with our leadership group, which Maggie and Sean are a part of, as well as some internal folks, as well as some further conversation with CS Arch. There's some decisions or some further direction that I provided them, just that I want you to be aware of for any discussion tonight, but also in preparation for them coming back next week. Site location 3. They have proposed as a potential area to place an auditorium if we aspire to have an auditorium on campus. And just through discussion, I am sure that would be beautiful and a beautiful location to put an auditorium and a student commons. That being said, that sits on, I think, a very unique part of our campus that potentially could interfere with the view shed, if you will, from different locations. In the absence of seeing what an actual auditorium would look like from different perspectives on that site location, it creates concern for me. Also, there's the potential for there to be a significant amount of bedrock underneath that area, which from a construction standpoint, a removal standpoint, could significantly drive up cost. And it just seems that it need not be a factor in our long-term planning, whether it's sooner or later when it comes time to construct, when there's other site locations that are an option to put the one piece, an auditorium, on or near. So I asked them to eliminate that from consideration, and they're doing so in their planning. Additionally, site location 2, the playground area. Something we've asked them to be considerate of in any further iterations is the impact that a large building project would have on the neighborhood. That's an area of our property that butts up right against or backs up to residential areas, and it's just something I think should not be the first space that we consider, unless it's absolutely necessary to. And then lastly, site location 2, that's the one I just spoke to. Site location 1, the Bell Lot, is an area that just along the way has, not for me, but for others, has drawn a unique attachment to that area. There's unique history there. The bell's there, even though we can move the bell, the rock, those can be moved. It just does seem to be drawing, in the various groups that we meet with, a level of concern about potentially building there. So you'll see next week that CS Arch has tried their best to work with current areas 4 and 5, which are direct extensions of the high school, to address the programmatic areas that would require potential building sites that are most directly related to the high school, and also the auditorium being a K-12 community space, but also to include it in those areas of the school. We think that will help them, potentially help us move forward in the conversation we were having in some ways here, and then also other groups that they're meeting with as well, help them move forward in discussion with those groups as well. And I'll use the term to arrive at consensus if we're going to build, where to build, or if the plans are to include building sites, where those building sites should be on our campus for a few projects that were presented to you last time. So I just wanted to mention that as a precursor to next week's conversation. And then obviously the board had a lot of dialogue last meeting. We just wanted to use this as another touch point for further discussion among the board before CS Arch returns next week.
I participated today in the larger group meeting, and I think we're in good shape in terms of the multiplicities of view that really was brought into the room. I think overall positive. I think central to our thinking moving forward, outside of the obvious, which is financing, is just what the phasing is going to look like, which I think is going to be important as we start to think about where to build, how to build, and when to build. Is, how can we really be thoughtful about when that, how we can build upon, project upon project upon project over time. So, and that's yet to come. That's my understanding. And I think, are we getting closer to really, I guess, committing to the process going into February as opposed to being done in December? Or are we just going to continue to sort of work till we get to a completed project?
I think because of this particular, the last discussion with the board, and I asked them we're not moving forward yet
Right.
until you come and meet with the board again. I'll be prepared to make a recommendation at our next meeting as it relates to site locations and if they're to be included, if an auditorium, for example, is to be included in the project or in the vision for this work, where it should go. And similarly with the potential for additional classroom space, we talked about the Mabel Merritt Building and the viability of that long-term as classroom space, where those spaces should go. So that would allow, if the board agrees, that then allows CS Arch to move forward with its process. But this little pause we've taken with this phase, just for further discussion, is likely to push their anticipated end date to at least January, if not early February. If we now get into successive phases of planning and we have to pause just to spend a little bit more time, then that could push that back further. But I think that's okay. Now's the time to do that. There's no rush, to finish by January. This doesn't have an implication on budget development for the upcoming school year. So I didn't think it would matter much I think the quality of the product and in particular the process and arriving at as much consensus as we can is more important than meeting a deadline of December at this point.
Particularly if they have the capacity to do so, then we're not.
I think, and I feel that.
Yeah, great. All right. Any other?
Well, it sounds like people are hearing feedback. It's definitely something being discussed in the community. I mean, that's why why we're in the process. I really like that, Dr. Benante took the opportunity to both allude to, need that's been acknowledged for a while and aspiration and, linking it to, our educational objectives for kids. I think this all makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And there's not a rush. I mean, this is figuring out what might make sense and what we might want to do. And so there's not a huge time pressure.
Yeah, and I would just say for myself, I know that I needed to recenter myself on what this process that we're looking at on the screen actually is, which is, for me, I got caught up in oh my God, we're deciding that we're going to do these things right now, which is not what the process is. The process is, we may want to do a couple things in the future. Let us plan now so that if in the future we want to do this thing, we don't have to reroute roads again, and we know where pedestrians are going to go, and it all works of a part. Totally makes sense. So regardless, and back to your, are there phases? First is like, okay, we have the plan. Now it's like, okay, what are the plan? What do we want to do? Or can we afford to do? Or how are we going to do it? That sort of makes sense. I will say, I'm sort of bummed about 3. I'm sort of bummed about taking 3 off. Only because, and I'll tell you why. There's an aesthetic. Right? I could see that being a really interesting
really
space.
Cool.
I also, and I understand that there's probably a ton of bedrock under there. But I also think that an auditorium is very much a shared space by the entire school. And I know that, like, the kindergartners use it, and as do the high schoolers. So having it central to warmed the cockles of my heart. So I don't know. I'm sort of bummed.
You can still do the auditorium there, buddy.
Yeah, I know.
It's actually that same spot. And it doesn't mess with the view shed. Everybody can use it.
That's right.
The auditorium.
We could be very Roman.
Yeah.
They're gonna be running roof
Yeah.
or something?
Speaking as somebody who spent months on the Nelsonville Zoning Board of Appeals addressing issues related to the potential cell phone tower and the issue of view sheds, I mean, it's quite possibly a very smart decision for us to have considered that, because I think it's the kind of thing that folks would have really noticed. It's the kind of thing here that people really value. And I am not unsurprised at all that people are having an emotional reaction to the Bell lot. Like, when I saw that, I was like, well, I'm going to be interested to hear what people have to say about that, And part of me was thinking, well, like, yeah, I know, but kids that are going to, graduate there in the future, they weren't here 20 years ago, but like, for decades, people have graduated there. People come to high school graduation every year who went to Haldane a long time ago. I mean, I have even been here that long. I mean, and that spot I have some emotional ties to that spot for high school graduation. I'll be honest about it, What can I say?
It's not just that, it's a good overlook of the river.
And
It is. It's another
but there again, like these views, like, like it really, the campus is so amazing because it is up on the hill and it does have these incredible views. And I think it was smart to think
I
ahead.
think you could do an auditorium at 3, where you're at grade coming out of high school, and you at grade coming in, right? It's a sketch. Absolutely.
I want you and the bucket loader doing it.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. No, with a giant jackhammer for like months. Yeah. All right.
All right. Moving on to new business, our CSE, CPSE recommendations. Ms. Shields?
Be it resolved that upon the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools, the Board of Education hereby approves the recommendation of the Committee on Preschool Special Education and Committee on Special Education as presented below.
Great. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? No? All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? No? All right, moving on to our second communication from the public. I don't believe we have anyone who's joined us. Let's move on to board reflections. We've all been reflecting considerably. Here's yet another opportunity to reflect.
I'll reflect on a couple things, and both involve the field.
Right.
The open, sort of a new business question, actually. I was at the game where the student was injured, and it was horrible. What I noticed was that it took a really long time for the ambulance to get down first they backed down, and we're all like, why are they backing down? And then they turned around and drove on the field, and we're like, well, they probably could have gone down straight. It made me wonder whether there isn't, but that path on the sort of the upslope side where kids just walk down.
Where the ambulance came down.
Not where the ambulance came down, but the dirt, so the dirt
yes.
where people walk down to the field, feels like the width of a car. And you end up at that little, I'm like, couldn't we just pave that so an ambulance could just go down there? But it felt like a really long time. There's probably a way to do it. But now, I think we've had 2 ambulances visiting just this year.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder whether there's a more efficient way to get medical attention down there.
Is that a question for Alteris, maybe?
I think the site work
Yeah.
potential is more of a question for Tim or facilities, because that's an area where I know we has to do with the water runoff.
I'm sure.
So I don't know really what, if any, work we can do, even that trail that goes down there.
Point for concern, because
Something for us to
everybody was there
consider.
watching for like 20 minutes
Yeah, it took-
while the ambulance backed up, and there's a kid lying on the field who seemed to be fine, visually fine.
Yes.
Everyone was calm around him, but if it were a serious emergency,
Yes.
The other thing related to that, I was approached by a couple people in the community who are older and have less mobility, and they said, hey, during games, could we make a couple spots right here for handicapped? And I'm like, that's a really good idea. I don't know whether we can actually do that by law, but being able to reserve a couple spots right at the top of that for people who are in walkers or have difficult
Absolutely.
mobility.
I think
was like-
CS Arch is on that. Quite
Okay.
frankly, they've brought up accessibility
Yeah.
a number of times in their discussions, not only in the buildings, this building in particular,
sure.
but also around the site.
Yeah.
So that's something that, as we're meeting with them, I'll be sure to include.
Yeah,
But yeah, it's not an easy campus to navigate,
Yeah.
and for a variety of reasons. And that whole issue, that whole area there, right? You can see even for EMS coming in,
right.
the way the parking lot's set up, it's difficult to get emergency vehicles
Right.
in. And then if you were leaving, depending on how you came in, they
Yeah.
were all still parked. And nobody can leave
Right.
because they're blocking everybody in, even though we wanted people to leave.
It'd be interesting to see, like, even for this weekend for homecoming, you're going to have people who've been in the
Right.
community for years who are in a walker.
Yeah.
Like, is there a way that we can set aside 3
And you can-
parking spots right there at the top for somebody?
inquire.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Anybody else have any reflections? I will say it was nice, I guess it was over last weekend, in the village of Nelsonville, we had a little potluck. And Peggy was there and Ezra was there, and I just want to let everyone know that the 3 of us were never alone in conversation at any time, creating a quorum. I had one-on-one, I had a one-on-one, but it was lovely to meet your family, and it was great to continually put a human face on everybody's here around the board.
All us in Nelsonvillians.
Yeah, yeah. And I agree with you about, I think one of the benefits of the retreat was getting to a place where, I think ideally in public meeting, we would all feel like our real selves and feel fully, entitled to speak what's on our minds in an honest and truthful way. So, that you felt like there's a vacuum where you are, I think is really telling that there's some work for us to do and how we sort of speak out collectively here around the table. So, yeah, all right. Dr. Benante?
No comments.
Great. Then I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? No? Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a long one.